Hey, this is Liz with the Bozeman Public Library. Welcome to another edition of the real stories of the people of the cold millions. This video is going to focus on John T. Sullivan, who was the acting chief of police in the novel. We're going to talk about how his actions were reported in one of the most read newspapers of Spokane, and of the alleged corruption which cost him his job and quite possibly his life. John Sullivan was an Irish immigrant, born in 1862 in County Kerry, Ireland. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1880 along with his older brother Dennis Sullivan, both settled in Spokane in August of 1889. Sullivan joined the police force on January 8, 1890, and became a captain in 1907. On May 14, 1909, he was appointed to serve as the acting police chief by Mayor Nelson S. Pratt. However, due to multiple scandals featured in the Spokane press, who brought formal charges against him, he was forcibly demoted from acting chief and subsequently resigned from the police force. On January 5, 1911, he was shot in his home. He died 2 days later in the hospital, blaming the Spokane press for his death. He was appointed to acting chief only 7 months before the events of the novel and the free speech battles that would rock Spokane and would be the beginning of his downfall. Sullivan was initially supported by the mayor and the Spokesman Review, but vilified by the Spokane press. I'll be referring to this newspaper as the press for the rest of this presentation. Most of the information for this presentation comes from the press, which was a pro-labor newspaper and may not have been altogether fair. However, since the press was instrumental in forcing Sullivan's retirement and tarnishing his reputation, this presentation will focus on what the press had to say and what they did. When Sullivan was first appointed, the press was open to his appointment. They celebrated the new mayor's desire to make Spokane a moral place to live and referred kindly to Sullivan's initial attempts to clean up the town, which included enforcing a law preventing screens on saloons, restricting times when places could serve alcohol, banning cigarettes, putting limitations on women's leisure activities, and cleaning up the resorts, aka the brothels. Very early on, the press starts to talk about favoritism that the police department used in enforcing the saloon rules. It was a complicated situation made even more complicated by some saloon owners appealing the screen requirements, which forced the police to wait for court rulings to enforce the rules, which means for a few weeks in early fall of 1909, a few businesses followed the rules and some notable ones did not. The favoritism issue in regards to gambling dens and resorts would be one of the many charges the press would bring against Sullivan. In the late fall and winter of 1909, the events of the novel took place. The book outlines a free speech battle that happened in Spokane. During this time, the police enforced a city ordinance which banned public speaking. They arrested many IWW members and others for giving speeches on the streets of Spokane. There were so many arrests that prisoners were also held at the Franklin School, without heat and on a starvation diet. They were subjected to useless manual labor, moving rocks from one pile to another. On December 23rd, the press reported that there were 570 ordinance violations and 432 arrests for disorderly conduct. 325 of those arrests resulted in convictions. Part of the press's issues with the chief of police regarded the treatment of prisoners, especially women in the city jail. The question of police treatment would lead to an ongoing battle between the press and the police department. It started when Elizabeth Gurley Flynn wrote about the time she was arrested and the actions of the police she witnessed while incarcerated at the station with other prostitutes. Gurley Flynn didn't start this battle, but she certainly lobbed a well-aimed volley at the chief's reputation. As the initial free speech protests faded, several IWW members brought lawsuits against the police, charging them with police brutality during their arrests and during their incarcerations. And the press began to focus on a series of negotiations about hiring police matrons to look after the county jails and make sure female prisoners were being treated fairly. The issue would last until a new chief police took over near the end of 1910, and it's clear from the article regarding this battle and Sullivan's refusal to even entertain the idea of hiring police matrons, the press began to lose respect for Sullivan and his department. Months after the free speech battle ended, multiple prisoners suffered from the starvation diet, resulting in death or the inability to work. After the free speech battle, the coverage of the police department changed dramatically, and the press increasingly became disillusioned with the police and started demanding reform. After months of scandals, bad press, and even the defamation lawsuit, on September 24, 1910, the press brought 8 formal charges against Sullivan to be heard by the City Council to determine Sullivan's future position with the police department. These charges were brought after months of investigations, scandals concerning the department, multiple cases of police abuse and fights between press and Sullivan. The charges are 1. Shielding Officer L.D. Gilder in the Elliott case, 2. Reduction of bonds and the disposition of the funds in the Chinese gambling case, 3. Conspiracy to ruin the reputation of the editor of the press, 4. Barring representatives of the press from an inspection of public records at the police station, 5. Improper regulation and favoritism in the control of the disorderly houses, 6. Demoralization of the police force, 7. Usurpation of the office of Chief of Police in violation of the city charter, 8. General unfitness for the position. Now we'll look at these a little more closely. The Elliott scandal began in the spring of 1910 with a young woman named Rose Elliott, who spent 2 weeks living with several police officers years older than her, Officers Hood and Gilder. She was at least 18 years old when these events took place, but is referred to as a young woman and girl by the press. Her adopted father, a veteran of the Civil War, was arrested after he confronted the officers engaging with his daughter. He was charged with assaulting an officer and imprisoned. His wife petitioned the chief to release him. The wife and another child, a young boy about 6 years old, had no income, no food, and no prospects with Father Elliott in jail. The police chief allegedly took statements from all involved, but found no fault and refused to release Father Elliott. Mother Elliott sought out the Grand Army for aid, and J.E. Clark from the Relief Committee agreed to look into it. The press called this man heroic. Clark took the issue to the police commissioner. Sullivan agreed to release Elliott and said he would reprimand the officers involved. The press was investigating police abuse and jail conditions as part of the fight to hire police matrons and reform prison conditions in the city when they uncovered the scandal. The Elliott scandal began in the spring of 1910 with a young woman named Rose Elliott, who spent 2 weeks living with several police officers years older than her, Officers Hood and Gilder. She was at least 18 years old when these events took place, but is referred to as a young woman and girl by the press. Her adopted father, a veteran of the Civil War, was arrested after he confronted the officers engaging with his daughter. He was charged with assaulting an officer and imprisoned. His wife petitioned the chief to release him. The wife and another child, a young boy about 6 years old, had no income, no food, and no prospects with Father Elliott in jail. The police chief allegedly took statements from all involved, but found no fault and refused to release Father Elliott. Mother Elliott sought out the Grand Army for aid, and J.E. Clark from the Relief Committee agreed to look into it. The press called this man heroic. Clark took the issue to the police commissioner. Sullivan agreed. Rose Elliott, the center of the scandal, changed her story multiple times. She first said she was a nurse for the officers when they were ill, and then she said she was fleeing her adopted father. Her 6-year-old brother is actually her son, and she named multiple people as his father over the course of the scandal, including her adopted father and his brother. After the scandal first erupts, Rose disappears for a short time. On April 30th, a witness from the press came forward saying that Rose was pregnant. On May 4th, volunteers from the Grand Army volunteered to join an investigation into the police actions regarding the case. The headline calls for an investigation, one of the first times that the press explicitly called for the removal of Sullivan as chief. May 4th is also the day when a witness confirms the rumor about the pregnancy and the abortion Rose had. Officer Gilder set up the abortion, which was illegal at the time. On May 5th, women who were involved in Rosie's abortion, which was a criminal action, were identified. On May 7th, 2 warrants for the arrest of those who participated in the abortion were issued, while Elliott and another witness were subpoenaed. Gilder notified the women involved in the abortion and attempted to aid them and convince them to flee to Canada. On May 9th, one of the women voluntarily surrenders and implicates Gilder. On May 10th, Gladys Britton and Gilder were arrested. Only one person, the midwife, remains not in custody. Gilder was ultimately arrested and imprisoned. Rose put under house arrest until she was finally told Sullivan that Gilder and the other officer coerced her, after months of sticking to her story that she was there voluntarily and fleeing her father. Rose Elliott, the center of the scandal, changed her story multiple times. She first said she was a nurse for the officers when they were ill, and then she said she was fleeing her adopted father. Her 6-year-old brother is actually her son, and she named multiple people as his father over the course of the scandal, including her adopted father and his brother. After the scandal first erupts, Rose disappears for a short time. On April 30th, a witness from the press came forward saying that Rose was pregnant. On May 4th, volunteers from the Grand Army volunteered to join an investigation into the police actions regarding the case. The headline calls for an investigation, one of the first times that the press explicitly called for the removal of Sullivan as chief. May 4th is also the day when a witness confirms the rumor about the pregnancy and the abortion Rose had. Officer Gilder set up the abortion, which was illegal at the time. On May 5th, women who were involved in Rosie's abortion, which was a criminal action, were identified. On May 7th, 2 warrants for the arrest of those who participated in the abortion were issued, while Elliott and another witness. Gilder goes to jail because Rose Elliott at last comes forward. The press demands Sullivan resign over his mishandling of the case, notably because he supported the officers involved and was accused of railroading the witnesses. Sullivan maintained Rose Elliott was not being coerced by the officers according to her statements. He claims he was merely going by the information she gave him, including an affidavit claiming that her adopted father impregnated her, which was proven false. Elliott claimed he was unable to produce a child due to injuries from the war. Elliott did sue Sullivan for these attempts to ruin his reputation and for wrongful imprisonment. On September 28th, Rose Elliott was released from the home of the Good Shepherd, where she was held during Gilder's case. She moved to Oregon to get married, but is a witness in 2 felony cases still pending, those of the woman who conducted the abortion. The press says that with Elliott gone, it would be hard to receive a conviction in those cases. On May 13th, the press started reporting on a case of missing bond money. In the previous December, 3 Asian gamblers were arrested and required to pay a bond. The bond was set as $100 apiece and the money collected. All 3 men left Spokane afterwards and never asked for their rebates. The Treasury Department of the city only received $150 of the bond records, indicate that it was changed from $100 to $50 in each case. The money is now gone. On the May 14th article, the press says they've seen similar cuts in bond money in other cases as well. Officer Pitts, who was a desk agent at the time, turned the money over to Sullivan and has the receipts to prove it. Sullivan claimed the rebate portion of the bond was returned to the payer the following day and produced a receipt for that payment. The press also speculated as to why the bond was so low compared to other bonds and similar offenses issued to other minority establishments, and says the low fee is evidence of favoritism shown by the police department to certain illegal enterprises. On May 23rd, the press reported that Pitts was reduced in rank and position and is being used as a scapegoat for Sullivan, who stole the money. They don't outright call Sullivan a thief, but they imply that the money is missing and Sullivan is responsible for it. Sullivan blamed Pitt for the disappearance of the paid bonds and took away his desk position, forcing him to work the beat and dismissing him when he failed to work the beat. Pitt claims this was an example of favoritism because those who are friends with the former captain retain their positions for more heinous offenses. This example of favoritism is part of the charge of demoralization that the press laid against Sullivan. The press ran multiple editorials in the spring and summer of 1910, claiming that Sullivan's police department harassed and arrested anyone that disagreed or reported corruption or abuse. In a very specific case that was printed on the same day that the press brought formal charges against Sullivan was an elaborate scheme to ruin the reputation of the editor, which is one of the charges laid against Sullivan. According to the press, this scheme happened around April 15th. A prostitute, Sadie Yvonne, was sent to the editor with a story that she would share information about their current fight with the police department if he came to her room where she worked. Once there, someone else in the building would summon the police and arrest the editor on the charge of unlawful cohabitation, and Sadie would plead guilty. The goal was to blacken the reputation of the editor. The plot apparently failed, and the woman fled Spokane for several months. On August 18th, the press printed a short conversation between the reporter, J.B. McKenzie, and Chief Sullivan, in which the chief told him all press reporters were banned from the station and were not allowed to view the police blotter or public records. In the conversation reprinted by the press, it's clear that the reporters aren't just barred from viewing the public records, but from entering the station altogether, except if they are going to the emergency hospital, which shares some steps with the police station. In the spring and summer, when the press began publishing more aggressive articles detailing the police department's conduct, especially after the Elliott case, Sullivan challenged them back. He sued the press for slander and was frequently unavailable for comments. The formal charge against Sullivan includes the ban on the press's reporters accessing public records at the police department. Other newspapers were not restricted from accessing the blotter and station. The reporter in charge indicated that Sullivan used vile language, which the press views as unbecoming of an authority of the law, and blocking only the press or any news organization from public records on his own was a breach in authority. Favoritism was a common complaint against the police chief, even near the beginning of his tenure. Favoritism was reported in all sorts of stories, such as how certain gambling halls, saloons, and brothels were allowed to work unimpeded by the police. Favoritism was also a charge directed at Sullivan towards his own men. On June 15, 1910, the press started printing stories about a specific gambling den behind the Havana cigar store, run by Sullivan's brother, Dennis. Multiple witnesses testified that the immoral enterprises flourished under Sullivan's department, and the ones that were protected were allowed to operate unimpeded. Marjorie Allen was one of the witnesses who testified in the council hearing against the police department, and Sullivan specifically. She claimed she made arrangements to purchase a building for a disorderly house and settled on a price with a man named Archie Ashe. She went to Sullivan to find out if she could, and didn't get a clear answer, so she waited on her purchase, and Ashe raised the price from $5,000 to $9,000. When she finally did purchase the building, she was assured by Ashe that she wouldn't be closed or shut down by the police. Ashe was taking care of the police protection for her business. She and other women who owned similar organizations paid a monthly amount precisely to keep the police away from their businesses. She was shut down by the police department within 3 weeks of opening, while other businesses of similar nature were allowed to continue. She also spoke about how prior to Pratt's administration, the women who paid these fines to keep their businesses open paid only $15 a month instead of the $50 she paid Ashe, and they were given receipts of the transaction. She also paid for a monthly medical examination fee in the prior administration as well. On June 23, 1910, the press reported on an off-duty officer shooting a man over a dispute in a bar room. Officer Lee Downey and Joe Curry got into an argument at the Orpheum, and Downey assaulted and chased Curry down the street. 20 witnesses saw the event, and 11 called the press to tell them their story. The police department released a statement saying Downey dropped his gun, causing an accidental discharge, which shot the young man. Downey was a 10-year veteran of the force at the time. Over the next few days, further articles would announce that Downey was suspended pending an investigation. Curry was shot in the back, and the press made comparisons to the LA case in terms of police brutality. The later hearing for the Detective Downey was disparaged by the press and called a farce. No witnesses were produced despite several of them coming to the press after the initial event, and since there were no alternate stories, Downey was reinstated. The press claims the issue with Downey is just another example of Sullivan's inept leadership, and Sullivan is responsible for all of the actions of his subordinates, especially in the situation with the Gilder in the Elliott case and Downey in this case. The press goes on to report in September that Curry is addicted to morphine and unable to work, and still there is no justice for his case. On September 27th, the press reported on another policeman breaking the law. Mike Washington pled guilty to robbery of a silk dress. The press calls him a protege and luminary of Sullivan. Apparently, Washington wasn't his real name. He changed his name after some trouble elsewhere and joined the police force using an assumed name. When Gilder's trial started on September 22, 1910, the press complained about how Sullivan's personal attorney was also defending the disgraced officer, and therefore this shows some collusion and favoritism between Sullivan and Gilder. On July 7th, the press reported that Sullivan was illegally holding the office of Chief of Police. According to Spokane City Charter, the acting position of Chief of Police could only be held for 5 days, and the mayor would need to reappoint them every 5 days. Sullivan argued against this charge by saying he wasn't a chief, but still a captain doing the duties of the Chief of Police. The press countered that he was drawing the salary of the police chief and was still responsible for the actions in the department while he was directing it. After Sullivan resigned, a new chief was appointed rather quickly, with no acting appointment. This mistake with the charter and appointment led the press to saying that there was no chief of police in Spokane, and was one of the charges laid against Sullivan during the hearing. The press had lots of evidence of Sullivan's unfitness for the position from the scandals happening during his tenure. After the free speech battle, the press began reporting about escalating tensions between the Women's League and the police force as part of a push for matrons to monitor jailed women. On January 27th, the press reported that the Women's Club in Spokane had decided to enforce reforms starting in the county jail. The Women's Club wanted to have a few women join the police force, but Sullivan is opposed to women being a part of the police or even as matrons for the city jail. The League found a Washington law that requires cities of more than 10,000 to have police matrons to have immediate care of all women in the city prison. This battle got really heated, and several investigations into the conditions of the police station were conducted, but the press disavowed each one as being whitewashed by the mayor and police commissioner. The press couldn't understand Sullivan's anger over hiring women, even after several reports of inhumane and subpar treatment towards women prisoners surfaced. One of the most scandalous episodes during this time came out of an affidavit produced by the women's group into the conditions of the prison, the Rose Elliott case. The press reported many articles regarding the conditions of city jail and the police force, so much so that Sullivan actually sued them in March 1910, saying he was being slandered. They didn't just focus on the treatment of women, but on the treatment of men, especially IWW members as well. Some of the accusations included a starvation diet that led to permanent disability and death, a holding room near the building's boiler that created unsafe conditions and torture, acts of police brutality and bribery, overcrowding of the jail, and wrongful arrests. During the lead up to the council hearing, Sullivan tried to have it dismissed in a court case. He resigned his position, countersued the press, and argued against each of the charges. Every day for over a month, the press included Sullivan in the news leading up to the hearing and rehashing the charges against him. On September 27th, the press demanded he be suspended until after the hearing. On October 8th, the press reported that Sullivan tried to prohibit the city council from hearing the charges against him. This didn't work. Throughout October, the press continues to discuss the charges, and the judge ruled in favor of the city council hearing the charges. On the 13th, Sullivan was attempting to force witnesses to leave town by police raids on the locations where witnesses worked. Sullivan argued against the charge that he was acting chief in the violation of city ordinance and instead was still just a captain, merely completing the duties and still drawing a chief's salary. The press countered with Sullivan was a responsible party for actions taken by the police while he was chief and therefore still held accountable, regardless of his title. On the 19th, the court rules that the city council will hear the charges against Sullivan. In response to this ruling, Sullivan hands in his resignation as acting chief of police. The mayor takes on the role until another person can be recruited. During the lead up to the council hearing, Sullivan tried to have it dismissed in a court case. He resigned his position, countersued the press, and argued against each of the charges. Every day for over a month, the press included Sullivan in the news leading up to the hearing and rehashing the charges against him. On September 27th, the press demanded he be suspended until after the hearing. On October 8th, the press reported that Sullivan tried to prohibit the city council from hearing the charges against him. This didn't work. Throughout October, the press continues to discuss the charges, and the judge ruled in favor of the city council hearing the charges. On the 13th, Sullivan was attempting to force witnesses to leave town by police raids on the locations where witnesses worked. Sullivan argued against the charge that he was acting chief in the violation of city ordinance and instead was still just a captain, merely completing the duties and still drawing a chief's salary. The press countered with Sullivan was a responsible party for actions taken by the police while he was chief and therefore still held accountable, regardless of his title. On the 19th, the court rules that the city council will hear the charges against Sullivan. Sullivan's attempts to not have the council hearing were thwarted, and on November 7th, the hearing began. On November 9th, several days after the hearing was supposed to begin, the press issued this formal invitation, inviting everyone who has been following the press stories to the trial held in the council chambers. Over the next few days, the front page of the press would feature stories and witness accounts taken during the hearings. On November 9th and 10th, the hearing started by trying to show how inept at the job Sullivan was. The Elliott case was rehashed. On the 10th, the hearing discussed the police department's policies in enforcing gambling and the resort laws, and the press specifically mentioned Sullivan's brother's gambling den as being protected and allowed to operate unimpeded by the police. On November 11th, the testimony of Officer Pitts in the bail bonds case was discussed, as well as favoritism and unequal enforcement. And on the 14th, the verdict is in. On November 9th and 10th, the hearing started by trying to show how inept at the job Sullivan was. The Elliott case was rehashed. On the 10th, the hearing discussed the police department's policies in enforcing gambling and the resort laws, and the press specifically mentioned Sullivan's brother's gambling den as being protected and allowed to operate unimpeded by the police. On November 11th, the testimony of Officer Pitts in the bail bonds case was discussed, as well as favoritism and unequal enforcement. Sullivan is found guilty of most charges. He is suspended for 6 months, and a grand jury is called to investigate all the officers of the city on the specific charges. The Elliott case was sustained. The Bonds case was sustained. Sullivan was not responsible for the conspiracy of the press, but the council admits that they believe a conspiracy happened. They ruled the press should have access to police and other public records, and on the issues of prostitution, the mayor and the police board are responsible, along with Sullivan, for not enforcing laws properly. Sullivan grossly violated issues on favoritism, and the council ruled that Mayor Pratt disregarded the city charter in keeping Sullivan so long without reappointment or making him a true chief. Sullivan was censured since he never answered the charges, and officers Downey and Hogan, who were both involved in police brutality incidences, were suspended as well. Unfortunately, Sullivan was never able to speak at the grand jury, and there were rumors that his death might have been caused by what he might have said during the trial. Instead, shortly after the hearing ended, the press returned its attention to Mayor Pratt's administration. On January 5, 1911, a few weeks before the grand jury would start, John Sullivan was at home while his wife went to the theater with her sister. A shooter slipped around the side of the house and around 7:45 fired a single shot that went through the window and the rocker the former chief was sitting in. The shot didn't kill him immediately. Sullivan made it to the telephone to call for help. He spent several days in the hospital before he died from the wound. He blamed the Spokane press for his death, though others suspected the Wobblies. He's quoted as saying, "I desire to make this statement. I attribute the shooting wholly and absolutely to the Spokane press and Fred D. Robertson. They have hounded and slandered me for years, and did all in their power to make me enemies. They alone are responsible for this affair. I forgive the man who shot me. I forgive everyone who ever did me wrong." Robertson was the attorney of the newspaper. By January 6, $16,000 in funds were raised as an award for anyone with information about the shooting. Sullivan's neighbors reported nothing suspicious in the neighborhood. Sullivan died on January 7th. There was a few suspects, including the Wobblies, and a criminal who shot Sullivan in 1901 and vowed retribution for his arrest. In 1924, in Alabama, Florence Miller told police that her husband, Victor Claude Miller, admitted to killing the Spokane chief after she shot and killed him in a domestic dispute. The police found a friend of Miller's who confirmed the story and discovered that Miller was working in the railroad in Spokane during the time when Sullivan was assassinated. He was already dead and could neither confirm or deny the charge. The shooter was never found. Ultimately, Sullivan played a very small part in the novel, but his position as chief, his interactions with the Wobblies, and what happened afterward left a tangible mark on Spokane for years to come. You can read more about the free speech battles in The Cold Millions by Jess Walter. This book is this year's One Book, One Bozeman choice. The book is available from the library or from one of our partners. Thanks! Have a great day!